Alright, in this video we're going to implement roles. So far, the way we have things set up is all of our admin controllers require that we authorize against the role admin. And then our custom role provider, we just simply check to see if the username is Nelson and return admin if he is. Well, obviously this is problematic, and we've already started work on this. In fact, if I go in here and look at my tables, we already have a roles table, and we have a roles users table, but we're not using this data anywhere. So the first step to actually use data inside of our application within Hibernate is to create an entity and to create the corresponding mapping, and then of course to add the mapping to the configuration. So I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call it role. Now a role is a very simple entity. All it has is a public virtual int ID and a public virtual string name. That is it. Next up, let's go ahead and create our role map. Our role map is simply going to be a class that inherits from class mapping of role. It's going to have a table of roles. Then it's going to have an ID. And it's going to have the property of name, which won't be nullable.
That didn't seem too bad.
Yep, again, this is just repeating stuff that we've already seen with the user. Keep in mind the two namespaces that popped up during me coding that.
Yepers.
The next thing we need to do is, now that we have our roles mapped, we can now query our roles, but we, at this point, can't query our role users. We're not actually going to create an entity for role users. In fact, per the definition of entity, role users isn't even one. An entity always has a unique ID. Role users doesn't have a primary key, it just has two foreign keys, because its existence is just to relate roles and users. Role users is known as a pivot table, in that it pivots between these two other entities. So how do we represent this relationship with code? Fortunately for us, nHibernate makes this stupidly simple, at least as stupidly simple as possible. Like, I don't mean to say any of this stuff is simple, I just mean to say that it would be a whole lot more complex if we weren't using nHibernate.
At the end of the day, we'll be really happy Hibernate did it.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is on user, I'm going to add a new property. The property is going to be a public virtual iList of role called roles. Note that a namespace did pop up, System Collections Generic. Now the roles list is going to be used to contain a reference to every single role that this user is a part of. And Hibernate will take care of the entire process of managing the database for us. Which is very nice.
That's sweet, yeah.
I am going to put in a convenience in here, however. Whenever you have a collection, it's important to instantiate it to something inside the constructor of the entity. The reason is if we instantiate a new user and immediately try to start adding roles to it, we'll get a null reference exception. That's because when we instantiate a user directly, such as in our users controller, when we create a user, right here,
Okay.
the roles array or list doesn't get set to anything. Which means if I tried to say user roles add bleh, right, it would throw an exception because roles would be null.
Gotcha.
When we retrieve a user out of nHibernate, however, nHibernate will override this to what it needs to be overridden to. But for the case when the entity is instantiated, I always like to make sure that all of my collections are also instantiated to empty lists. So now we have this here, but it's not going to do anything because we haven't mapped it. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a bag. It's going to be a role bag. What's a bag? Well, in nHibernate terminology, a bag is simply a collection. nHibernate has bags and sets and lists. Bags are the ability to relate an entity one or more times to another entity. Lists are a way to order an entity in order to another entity, and sets are used to relate unique entities between each other. In this case, we want a bag.
All right, that makes sense.
Now, the bag needs 2 bits of information, actually 3 bits of information. What does it need? Well, it needs to know the name of the pivot table. It needs to know the column that represents the user ID, and it needs to know the column that represents the role ID. So we need to provide that information to it. The first bit is easy. We can simply say x.table user or role users. The next one is simply the key. Now this key is the key to the current entity, and that rhymed. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify k goes into k dot column user ID. That's because the key we're specifying is the one that maps to the entity we're mapping. Notice also how I use the word the single character k. Because these mappings are so dependent on lambdas, I just throw single letters at them for their parameters. But we have to use k here because we're already using x in a nested lambda.
Gotcha.
So we have to use k. If we used x here, it would die. The important thing to note is that k and x are completely arbitrary letters that happen to be close to where my fingers were on my keyboard at the time.
Gotcha.
Okay, the last thing we need to do, now that we've said we have a collection of roles, we need to tell it that it's a many-to-many association as opposed to a many-to-one or a one-to-many association. To do that, we specify another parameter or another argument into bag where we simply say x many-to-many, k goes into k column role ID. Remember, 3 bits of information. Now I know it looks a little confusing why we have to specify these 3 bits of information like seriously all over the place, but it makes sense if you have worked with mappings before, which I'm assuming you guys haven't, but once you start working with mappings more, it'll make more sense. The only thing that a person new to nHibernate needs to understand is we told nHibernate the collection, right? The roles.
Yeah.
We told nHibernate the pivot table name.
Role users.
We told it the ID of the user on that table. And we told it the ID of the role on that table.
Perfect.
That's it. We now have roles being mapped. So let's put it to the test. I'm going to use my fancy little auth class that we wrote a couple videos ago, and I'm going to reference it inside of my role provider. What I'm effectively going to do is I'm going to say return auth.user.roles.select role goes into role.name.toArray.
Okie dokie.
Note that this brought in system.link.
Indeed.
So, what is this doing? It's simply searching for all the roles in the currently logged in user, selecting out their name, and returning an array. That's it. That means if I come back to my website, or hit F6 of course to build, and I come back to my website and hit F5, what do you think is going to happen, Steve?
I think it's going to work.
I wouldn't be so sure about that. Oh.
Oh.
Actually, that wasn't the thing that wasn't supposed to not work, but it is a thing that wasn't supposed to not work, so I was half right, right?
All I know is I was totally wrong.
This will happen a lot. I'm going to go into my database. Remember how I said we added a new mapping? Well, we actually have to tell the mapper about the mapping. I usually write a little bit of code that scans my assembly for class mappings that are marked up with a specific attribute. However, we're just going to keep things as simple as possible here. So I'm going to say mapper.addMapping role map. Then I'm going to hit F6. Okay, and now we'll get a problem, but a different problem.
Alrighty.
It kicked us back.
Why'd it do that?
Well, we're still logged in. It says, welcome back, Nelson. Right?
Yeah.
But we can't get into the admin.
What have we done?
We are now pulling our role information from the database, and we don't have any association between my user, user 6, and the role admin, role 1.
We deleted those before, so there's nothing there to tell it.
Yep. So what we have to do is, in order to get back into the admin, we have to manually insert a role into the database, which is very easy with simple SQL. I can simply say insert into role users, user ID, comma, role ID, values of my user ID followed by the role ID. My user ID is 6, and the role ID I want is 1. So I'll say 6 comma 1. I'll hit Control Enter, make sure that it executed, which it did. And now I should be able to hit the back button. Hey, look at that.
That is pure magic.
Indeed, I am now an admin.
Sweet.
But you're not.
I know.
Okay, so we have one more thing to do with our roles and stuff. And that is, we actually have to go in and make it so that we can select the roles that a user is associated with on both the create screen and the edit screen. So you ready for this? I'll take that as a yes.
Sorry, I was muted. I am ready.
Okay, so I took that as a yes. That works, I suppose. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, the first step is we need to show a list of roles for that the user can have on the new screen and the edit screen. How do we send information back from the controller to the view? We do it through our view model. So let's jump into our users new, and let's go ahead and add in something. I'm going to do something a little crazy. I'm going to take full advantage of the fact that we have view models. The whole point of a view model is to separate out the concerns of our views from our rest of our logic, which means we can have our view models formatted however we want, and it won't actually have an effect on the rest of our program, which gives us a lot of flexibility. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class called role checkbox. The role checkbox is going to have a public int ID, a public bool is checked, and a public string name. Then on my user's index, my user's new, I'm going to say public ilist, of role checkbox roles. Now, why am I doing it like this? Why am I just not sending in an ilist of roles? Well, the reason I'm doing it like this is because although I am presenting the user with some data that was gathered from the controller, I also need the view to be able to submit back to the server to tell us what roles the user checked. So that's why I'm using a completely different type of model. I'm using a very simple little data transfer object that allows us to take advantage of ASP.NET MVC's model binder. So how do I fill in these roles? Well, I'm going to go back into Users Controller, and I'm going to fill it in on New. Because remember, we have to specify this data on the controller side. So I'm going to say role. I almost typed in trolls. Roles equals database.session.query role dot select. Role goes into new role checkbox with the following values. ID is role.id. Is checked will always start off being false. Name is role.name. Finally, I have to turn it into a list. So by doing that, I'm taking data from our database and I'm munging it into a format that our views can understand.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and jump into our user's new view and actually create our role select. So I'm going to jump into users new, and I'm going to add something after password. It's going to have a div, class, panel default. These are classes from Bootstrap. It's going to have a div, class, panel heading of roles, and then it's going to have a div, class, panel body of a list of roles, which will be a UL with a class of list group and a for loop that says for var I equals 0, I smaller than model roles dot length dot count derp I plus plus. So we're going to loop through all of our roles and we're going to display them as checkboxes. However, since we're in an LI or a UL, I have to wrap this in an LI, which is simply going to be list group item. Again, this comes from Bootstrap. So what am I going to put in here? Well, I'm going to put in two things. I need to bind to a list on the post. I want it to be that when the model binder examines our request, once we hit the submit button, it will actually hydrate our role checkbox list into something usable. So we need to write our form fields in a format that it understands. It's actually very easy to do. I'm going to do html.hidden. I'm not going to do HTML hidden for. I'm going to give it the name of roles at .id plus plus id with the value of model roles at .id. So I'm creating a hidden input. Look at what I'm doing here. This is syntax that is specific to the ASP.NET model binder. If it sees this, what it'll do is it'll match it up to this list and hydrate these objects with these values. Next up, I have to create the checkbox. So I'm going to say label, and I'm going to say for. Now this is going to be really scary, but I'll talk about it in a second. Oops. I keep on wanting to put ID instead of I.
I can't hold you at fault for that.
Again, if this is a little scary, we will talk about it. So what is going on with this? Okay, so we created a hidden input for our role ID so that the model binder can associate whether or not a role is checked with a particular ID, right?
Right.
Then we created a label for roles with a checkbox inside of it and the name of the role printed out. But look at the for attribute. The for attribute is roles underscore I underscore underscore is checked. That's because HTML or ASP.NET MVC generates the ID of all of these fields as its name, but it turns all special characters into underscores. Because the for attribute has to point to a ID, we do it like this.
Okay.
So if I go ahead and build, and I come in here to create a user, should see a fancy little checkbox for admin.
Look at that.
Let's go ahead and throw in another role just to do something else. Let's do a moderator, author, and user, just to make it a little bit bigger. Go out of here, hit refresh, and we now have our admin, moderator, author, and user.
Very nice.
So now what we want to do is we're faced with a fairly large issue. The issue we're faced with is in our user's controller, we need to get the values that were sent in from the roles from the user. We need to rehydrate the objects, the roles' names, make sure they exist on the database, and set them up on the user object. Before we do that, let's go ahead and look at what's generated. So look at these names. We have an input ID roles at 0.id, roles at 0.is checked. We have another one. Roles at 1.id and roles at 1.is checked. Let's see what the ASP.NET MVC model binder turns this into. I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint here and hit F5 to debug. And then off screen here, I'm just going to type in some bogus information into this form and then select a couple roles and hit create user. So now we're looking at execution paused right here on this line. Let's examine the form and see what is in there. We have 4 roles. Now we see that one is the user is checked, author is not checked, the moderator is checked, and the admin is not checked. So we see that the model binder was intelligent enough to actually put together a list for us based off the way that we constructed the names of our form elements.
Alrighty then.
So now we can take this data and use it. Sound like fun?
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Okay. I'm going to create a helper method down here at the bottom. And the reason I'm doing that is because we have a bit of logic that we want to be able to reuse for both our new and our edit. And the method is simply going to be private void sync roles. It's going to take in a list, and this list is going to import system collections generic, by the way, at the top of the file. Role checkbox, and we're going to call them checkboxes. And then it's going to take an iList of role called roles. Then we're going to write logic that will synchronize these two collections so that they are identical. How do we do that? Well, I'm going to say var selected roles equals new list of role. For each var role in database session query role. So I'm querying all the roles in the database. I'm going to say var checkbox equals checkboxes.single cid equals role.id. And then I'm going to say checkbox.name equals role.name. That'll update the names on all of our checkboxes, which is nice. Then I'll say if the checkbox is checked, if the checkbox is checked, then add it to our selected roles. Specifically, add the role to our selected roles. Right?
Correct.
Now we have to do two more steps. Remember, the checkboxes represents what the view sees. This is what's on our model. So now we have to synchronize between what the checkboxes say what role is checked and what the roles on the user actually has. There's one of two things that's going to happen. Either we need to add a new role to the user, or we need to remove a role from a user. How do we calculate that? It's actually very easy. I can simply say for each var to add in selected roles where the role is not contained in the user. So we want to loop through every role that's in our selected roles but not in the user roles. And then we want to add it to the users. Next up, we want to remove roles we need to remove. This is basically the operation in reverse. We loop through all the roles that are on the current user, and if they don't exist in the selected roles, then we remove them. But we also have to go ahead and do a .toList. And the reason we have to do a .toList is we have to actually perform this entire calculation before we start the for each loop and store it in a separate list, because what we're going to be doing here is we're going to say roles.remove to remove. If we didn't have that toList in there, it wouldn't perform this entire operation immediately. And because it wouldn't do that, we would throw an error when we tried to remove a role, because we would be modifying the collection that we're querying against.
Alrighty, I got that.
All right. So this is our sync roles method, and it can be used to sync roles between checkboxes and actual roles on a user. So let's see how it can be used. Inside of the new method, I'm going to change things up a little bit. I'm actually going to instantiate the user at the top of the method. I'm going to say var user equals new user, and then I'm going to say sync roles form roles user roles. So by doing this, we will get a slight error, and that's because I accidentally did a list instead of an iList down here. Sorry about that, guys. It should have been an iList. We come up here. So we sync the roles, and then we do our validation. Now, instead of recreating the user here, we're just going to say user.email equals form email. User.username equals form.username. And then user.setPassword.
Alrighty.
The sync roles will handle adding the roles to the user. But remember, even though we're adding the roles to the user object before validation, if validation fails, we're going to be exiting out of this method before it's saved to the database. So we don't have to worry about that.
Perfect.
So let's hit F6, create a user, and let's make him a author and a moderator. So this is a person, person at place.wo or com. Password is irrelevant. He's going to be an author and a moderator. I'm going to hit create user. And now we have a person. Let's jump into our database and see how our pivot table looks. Look at that.
By golly.
This user now has 2 roles.
Very nice.
So the next thing I'm going to do before I implement the edit screen is I'm going to figure this out right here. I want to display all the roles right here. That's actually very easy to do. I'm going to go into my index page, and on my roles column, instead of to do, I'm going to replace that with string.join, comma, on user.roles.select, role goes into role.name. Effectively, what that's doing is it's selecting the name out of all the user's roles and joining them together with a comma.
And now you can see why you set this up earlier and then just replace to do.
Right.
Made it easier.
Now I hit refresh and look at that.
Very nice.
So the last piece of the puzzle is the edit page. Now, fortunately, the edit page is going to be very similar to the new page, and it's going to allow us to explore a very common or useful technique in views, templates. But before I get to that, I want to just finish up the admin for the edit page, because it's going to be so easy. I'm going to go into, the controller and the view model. The view model is going to have the same thing. It's going to have a public iList of role checkbox roles get set. So it's going to have the exact same thing as the user's new, right?
Right.
In the admin, we have to make 2 modifications. The first modification is we have to copy all this over on the edit form itself. Now, in addition to that, we also have to fill out the isChecked, because if the user already has that role, we want it to default to isChecked to be true, obviously, to show them that they have that role. So we're going to copy and paste this code into the edit view, the edit get page here. I'm going to paste it in here. The only thing I'm going to change is if isChecked equals false. It's no longer going to be isChecked equals false. It's going to be isChecked equals user.roles.contains role. So it's checked if the user already has that role.
All right.
The next thing I have to do, and the final thing I have to do, is pretty straightforward. On the edit post, I simply have to say sync roles form.roles user.roles. That's it.
Easy peasy.
So this effectively makes it so all I have to do is implement the front end. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, I'll just copy and paste this here. Like, it seems that we copy and paste lots of code all the time. And we do, but for reasons. In this case, I don't see any actual good reason to have this copied and pasted into the edit form, because it is the exact 100% verbatim same thing.
So we should just write something short to link to that.
Yes, which we are going to do, and they are called partials.
Excellent.
I'm going to right-click users, hit add, create a new view, and I'm going to call it role editor, and I'm going to hit add. I'm going to delete everything in role editor. Now note the underscore. I'm putting the underscore there as a convention to say that this is a partial and not a normal view. But it's going to be a strongly typed partial, which we can do. We can simply say the model is iList of simple blog add areas admin view models role checkbox, which means that this model is the same type of the property that we have on both the edit view model and the new view model. So how do I move this over here? Well, it's very simple. I hit Control X, come over to Role Editor and hit Control V. you'll immediately notice errors popping up. And that's because the model inside the partial refers to this object. It does not refer to a specific view model, which means we no longer have to qualify our property access with roles. We can simply say model.count because model is of type iList role checkbox. So now we can just delete that from oldest red, and we now have a partial that can be included on both the new form and the edit form.
Sweet.
So to include it, I have to go into the new.cshtml and say html.partial, and I'm going to say underscore role editor, and then I'm going to pass in model.roles into it. By doing that, I am including in the role editor, and I am passing in the role object that the role editor uses to present its form. Then I'm going to jump into edit. I'm going to go right here to relatively the same position, do html.partial underscore role editor model.roles. Hit F6. Come back into our admin, hit refresh. Let's go ahead and edit Steve, and hey look, our roles magically appeared.
Sweet. I can be an admin. Yay!
No, you're just a user.
No, CIR.
See?
Very nice.
Yeah, sorry. Well, when you actually, like, for people following along, and if this is their first, like, web development experience, then, yeah, this will be super fun to see working. Oh, crap.
What have you done?
I was just mindlessly clicking around and talking, and I accidentally removed the, the admin role from my user. Yeah, you don't want to do that.
It's karma.
Yeah. Hold on. I think I still have that insert. Yeah, here we go. I'm just going to re-execute that insert statement, and that should give me admin access again. Yep.
Very nice. Actually, that's cool they got to see that. Don't do that.
Yeah, don't. All right. I think that just about wraps up our entire user admin. There's not a whole lot more to say about it. So I guess we will see you in the next video.
Sounds like fun.